Want to use a PGR in your cereals but have no time for a separate pass? Manipulator PGR can be applied as early as one tiller. Just add it to your herbicide to reduce lodging, increase harvest efficiency, and maximize yields. Talk to your retailer for more info and to confirm acceptable tank mixes.
Good day, and welcome to Wheat Pete's Word here on Real Agriculture for Wednesday, May the 15th, already halfway through May. On this episode of The Word, a big win for agriculture. For goodness sakes, be safe. Is it late? Is it late? Should we get out the gate? Glen Corn, man. Then agronomy answers lots of questions, and if I get to it at the end, some really cool stuff to cover. But I'm going to leave that to the end to make sure I cover as many agronomy answers as I can. Let's go! Yes, a huge win for agriculture. Gene editing in Canada. So this is the CRISPR technology where we can knock out specific genes. One of these days we'll be able to build in genes, but that isn't quite here yet. Nonetheless, it has been determined that gene editing is not a novel trait or a genetically modified organism. Man, this is a huge win because it really fast tracks the registration process for any of the varieties that come on stream, any of the traits that come on stream. By doing this, it also hopefully will help the public perception point of view, because now it's that these genes exist. We're just editing them in the plant. We're not taking, the sunflower HB4 gene, which is the drought tolerance gene, and putting that into wheat. And that's a huge win if we can do that, because it gives drought tolerance to the wheat crop, and they have done that. But that is a much tougher process to get through registration here in Canada than it will be with this gene editing technology. So that, yes, a huge win to start off Wheat Pete's Word for May the 15th. That's awesome. Next, wow, in Manitoba, a farmer and his operators, a dairy farmer, are being sued for a mud slick that they left on a highway. This is going back a couple of years. I'm really interesting case because motorcycles came along, and one of the motorcycles, actually the driver was killed. All of the motorcycles wiped out. Horrendous, absolutely horrendous. But the company, the farmer, is being sued for the damage to the motorcycles. And if this actually goes through, if they win that case, it really does ramp up the impetus that all of us have to take when we're looking at what happens on the highway. So please, be safe, for goodness sakes. Think twice, act once. But remember, if you drag mud out onto the road, you need to clean it off. You don't want to have anybody get in an accident and get injured, or worse yet, killed. And when we're moving down the highway, it's late. I get it. It's May the 15th. We're only 40% corn planted roughly here in the southwestern part of the province. When you go east, it's only 15% of the corn. We need to go when the ground gets fit. But if you're moving down the road, creating a huge dust storm because you're on the shoulder, that's a hazard. And we have to remember that what we do on the roads has massive impact on the public. And I get that the public doesn't respect what we do. I get that. But we still have to try to be safe. So please, please, please think twice, act once. You're moving down the highway, you get a big pile of cars behind you, try to find a spot to pull over. You're only holding them up for 20 seconds or a minute, but man, please be safe. Okay, I'm going to move on. And man, is it late? Should we just rush out the gate and get it done? Yeah, it is getting late. And I did promise I would talk about switching corn hybrids on the May 15th edition. So Paul Hermans, Lindsay Smith on the Tuesday radio show did just an excellent job of interviewing Paul Hermans. He's an agronomist with Pioneer in Eastern Ontario. Some really great data. So remember, if you are 2,800 heat units or less, then you start thinking about switching hybrids on May the 20th. And if you're really short season, if you're in the Dundalk Highlands, on May the 20th, you maybe say, to heck with corn, we're only going to plant soybeans now because the risk of low test weight gets that significant. But that's kind of the 2,600 heat unit area and shorter. 2,800 heat unit, May 20th, you start to think about changing. If you're between 2,800 and 3,200, it's May the 25th. That gives us a full 10 days. And so stay calm because, man, the end of the world has not yet happened. And touch wood, it looks like the weather, the rainfall that keeps supposed to happening, a lot of areas starting to miss some of those showers. We might get that window. If you're 3,200 heat units and greater, it's June the 1st. So that's when you start thinking about switching corn hybrids. You reduce your maturity by 100 heat units a week. That's basically 3 days. If you're looking at, a 99-day corn, you go to a 96-day corn. The first week, you go to a 93-day corn. The next week, because I think now lots of people talk days, even though heat units is a more accurate measurement system. But here's some of the cool stuff that Paul Herman's talked about this. And Lindsay, I'm sure will link that interview in the post here. But as you move later, you lose about 2 to 5% in yield, or kind of that 5 bushel per acre range for every 10 days that you go later, up until, there's a point where you fall off. But those first few weeks or couple of weeks that you lose, you're not losing much, because if you wait for the soil to be fit, you gain 5 to 10% in yield by planting into good conditions that give you uniform emergence. How many times have we talked about the importance of uniform emergence in the corn crop? So lose 2% or even 5% to get into those good soil conditions. You gain at least that 5% back with uniform emergence, and maybe 10%, which is double the amount that you've lost. So don't panic quite yet, but be just quite rational. And depending on where you're at, you hit those dates, then you start to shorten up maturities if it doesn't look like you can get to the field in the next day or two. The other really interesting thing in Paul's data from Eastern Ontario is we worry lots about test weight. Test weight losses until June the 1st were fairly minor, about a pound per bushel. On June the 1st in Eastern Ontario, the wheels fall off. So for sure, you do hit that point. But it was a fairly minor test weight loss up until June the 1st, and most of that area is kind of in the 2,800 to 3,200 heat unit zone. So you would change on May 25th. And the increase in moisture, we all talk about that lots. It was only about 1% increase in moisture for every 10 days that you planted later, until again June the 1st, and then it jumped 9% or something like that. So it's really interesting from that perspective. The other thing that Paul talked about is that corn adjusts. So as you take a hybrid, you plant it the first week of May, you plant it the first week of June, that same hybrid on average takes about 244 less growing degree days to mature planted June 1st than it does May the 1st. And so the corn plant adjusts in terms of the amount of heat that it needs to mature. So those adapted hybrids, you certainly can push right up until that magical change date, or maybe even a few days past, and not really take much of a hit. You just can't go past that drop dead date. And that's different for every region. It's probably June 1st for the 28 to 3,200 heat units, or maybe even June the 5th. If you get into 3,200 plus, you guys know in that area, you can plant till June the 15th and not have a big risk. You got to shorten your heat units a bit, but you don't have a big risk. While we're on that, wheat adjusts in terms of its maturity as well. I've talked about this, but I really expected that wheat field north of London, planted September the 15th, was flag leaf stage on May the 1st. I said in head on May the 15th. Lawrence at Park Hill and Woody in Dresden area both tweeting out wheat at the just starting with heads emerging, heads half emerged. I went to look at that field. I thought it'll be there. No, it was just barely starting to break. I was using 100 growing degree days per growth stage. That's early planted wheat. It's taking 110 or 120 growing degree days per growth stage. So combining that wheat at the last week of June, that's probably a push. First week of July, it'll be there, but it's probably a push for the last week of June. And I hope we don't, because if we combine it the last week of June, it means it had a shorter grain fill period. We want that long grain fill period to get big yields. Okay, let's stay on wheat. Lots of things happening in the wheat crop. First off, physiological fleck. Oh my gosh. This is sunburn on the wheat leaves. It's just UVB radiation. There's nothing you can do about it. You look at those leaves, you say, oh my gosh, I have septaria. It's the end of the world. Like, how could this be? It's just showed up, and it's terrible overnight. Yeah, well, if it's the top leaves, even if we have seen some on the second leaf down, but if it's not moving from the bottom up, if you don't see lesions with little black pepper spots in them on the lower leaves, because that's septoria, lesions with those little black pepper spots in them. If you can't find lots of those in the lower canopy, that's not septoria on the upper leaves. So it's physiological fleck. We're seeing tons of it. It's because of all the cloudy days that we get. Thin cuticle, lots of moisture, no reason for the plant to make a cuticle. And guess what? Then the sun comes out and it's bright and it's glorious and we love how warm it feels. And it sunburns the wheat leaves, and that's just, and there's huge varietal differences as well from that perspective. The other thing, barley yellow dwarf virus. We are getting lots and lots of samples coming back positive for barley yellow dwarf virus. This is part of climate change and the fact that we are planting earlier to get big yields. We all want to plant wheat at the beginning of the window for highest possible yields, even ultra early sometimes, but mostly we're just, that's the optimum planting date, September 20th for Johnson at Lucan. It's September 25th, so I want to plant September the 18th. I want to be right at the start of that window because that gives me the highest yield potential. Guess what? That's when the aphids are still flying around in the fall. That's when you get barley yellow dwarf virus that really causes yield loss. My field north of London, it is polluted with barley yellow dwarf virus. It will reduce the yield somewhat. It's not a disaster by any stretch. But if we're going to control it, on that early planted wheat, and only the early planted wheat, I don't want to use it prophylactically because we don't need to on the later planted wheat. On early planted wheat, we do have to look at a seed insecticide to stop the aphids from moving that disease from plant to plant to plant. There's mildew in the wheat crop as well. There's a number of growers who have sprayed their T1, their T1.5 fungicide, and the mildew is still there. It's in the lower canopy. It's not horrendous, but they're looking then at the label or at the crop protection hub. That's sort of the new place you go to get all your weed control, all your disease control, insect control information. And they're saying, oh, wait a minute, that particular fungicide, it doesn't control mildew. Oh, come on. Look at the active ingredients. There are a number of fungicides out there that give pretty good control, at the very least, excellent suppression of powdery mildew. They're not worse than the other fungicides. They just don't have mildew on the label, and that's a label glitch. So don't get too bent out of shape on that. It's just that if you have a highly susceptible variety, something, not to pick on one in particular, but it does tend to be one of the worst, B654, high yield potential, lots of straw. It's particularly weak on mildew resistance or doesn't have mildew resistance. The fungicide simply can't do it all itself, and so you end up with some mildew down in the canopy, even though you sprayed. It's not yield limiting, so not a big deal from that standpoint. Just to finish up quickly on wheat, two things. Joe asking me about a T3 fungicide. Joe's wheat's coming out in head. He's in Chatham, Kent. He says, if it stays dry, do I spray a T3 fungicide? Do I get that yield back? Do I overcome the yield loss from the tramp damage? Well, don't forget, stripe rust is now confirmed in Kentucky. Dennis Pennington in Michigan State found 2 pustules or 2 small lesions on susceptible varieties in Michigan. Now, that's not an alarm bells. That's not Wheat Pete going alert, alert, alert. but it is kind of okay. Stripe rust is around. If you get stripe rust on a moderately resistant or susceptible variety, it can have fairly significant impact, and it's one of those diseases that blows up in an unbelievably short period of time. Like 4 days, you can go from the odd lesion to being almost annihilated by stripe rust. It's another reasons that pushes you towards using a T3 fungicide. I just think it's probably a good strategy for 2024. Last, cereal leaf beetle. We're seeing some cereal leaf beetle out there. You know, we have lost Lambda cyhalothrin, or Matador, if you will. It's not going to come back, at least in the short term. That leaves only malathion for cereal leaf beetle control. It's a very hot product. Gosh. They're out there. They're not at most cases, they're not at threshold levels, but watch spring cereals that you've planted, because there's enough adults out there that it could be an issue. And the fact that we have only one product and user toxicity is a concern. That's not a good place to be in, that's for sure. All right, I need to move on. Dang! A grower calling in, leaving a message saying, Peter, you always talk about phosphorus and potash. We have to replace what we take off. And then you say micronutrients, do not apply anything until thou seest a deficiency. What the heck? How does that work? Why don't we just apply a couple of pounds of boron or manganese or zinc every year? Because that way we're replacing what's taken off. That's a fair comment. But it's not a couple of pounds. It's 10 grams. It's 12 grams. The amount that comes off is so tiny, to try to replace that gets really, really, like you're spreading such a small amount. You'd almost have to put it through your sprayer. And to apply 2 pounds, you can say, well, I'm building up the soil. You're not really with many of these nutrients, like boron in particular, will leach out. Manganese gets tied up in the soil. So treating the deficiency at this point makes far more economic sense than just trying to maintain the soil test levels. And every micronutrient's a little different, but that's why we don't talk about replacing them the same way we do with phosphorus and potash. Okay, a caller saying volunteer Roundup Ready canola. In fact, he said on the message, why did they even invent that technology? We grew it, then we grew soybeans after it, and we grew Extend soybeans. The dicamba barely kept the volunteer canola at bay. Too late to plant corn in my area now. We couldn't get spring wheat. It's too wet. We got to go back to soybeans again. There'll be Extend soybeans. What do I do to control that volunteer canola? Well, first off, go to the Crop Protection Hub. That's where you find that information. When you plug in Extend soybeans and you plug in Volunteer Roundup Ready canola, Triactor gives 95% control. It's got flumoxazine in it, it's got metribuzin in it, it's got imazethapyr. All three have activity. You can use other products that get 75% control, but Triactor, it's not cheap, but it will give really great control on that volunteer canola. So that is the herbicide of choice. Annual ryegrass. We've talked about how tough it is to control. Alyssa Esman from the Ohio State University put out a nice little article on how to control that. We'll link it. Basically, it is high rates of glyphosate and maybe a sniff of Aragon, salflufenicil, to help control. Peter Sikkema, he also tweeted out his research data. It would agree with that. It's really tough. That's why we don't want it in our cover crop species. But so an excellent article there. High rates of glyphosate, sniff of Aragon. Brett saying, man, I'm an organic farmer. We used kale in our cover crop mix. I'll never do that again. Does it ever come back? Well, yeah, the cover crops are great, but man, you really have to know the impact of them in your production system. Adam sending me an excellent history on how they tried to control annual bluegrass, burnt down alfalfa, went in with just straight glyphosate last fall, should have got it. Peter Sikkema's data says should have got it. Went in the spring with glyphosate plus integrity, 1.5 liters of glyphosate. Should have got it. Nope, didn't get it. It has got new root growth. It is healthy as heck. So Adam, our best recommendation is Steadfast with a high rate of Roundup, and you do it as quickly as you can. hopefully the rimsulfuron in the steadfast bumps up the Roundup enough, the glyphosate enough, that we can actually get good control. These weeds, man, they can be tough. And with that, dang it, I am out of time. I almost should do like Tyler said and just do another word episode sometime with cool stuff that I never seem to get to, or if I do get to it, it takes too long. But not happening this week. That's it. That's all. On behalf of the team here at Real Agriculture, this is Wheat Pete with the word for Wednesday, May the 15th. Hey, please keep the questions, the comments, the feedback coming, because I love it all. And I will be back next week to once again talk for way too long. See you then.